Hello everybody, whatever time of the day it is, and wherever you are around the world. It's my great pleasure to welcome you again for another edition of the Silver Jubilee series of webinars of the World Federation of Neurorehabilitation. It may have taken you wonder to some extent that we do a webinar on neurophilosophy, or philosophy in neurorehabilitation to be precise. About 1.5 years ago, so we decided that it would be a good idea to have philosophy.
I cannot activate my audio. I don't understand why. It should be okay. Also, this morning I used my audio with Zoom, and it was working.
Yeah. Well, Tommaso, can you hear me? Well, okay. We tried to fix that in the meantime. Never mind. It may have taken you wonder that we have a webinar on philosophical issues in the world of neurorehabilitation. We made this decision about roughly 2 years ago to have a new special interest group on neurophilosophy in neurorehabilitation, or philosophy in neurorehabilitation, however you want to phrase this. The idea behind this is that we conceive, as all of you know, neurorehabilitation as part of clinical neuroscience or of neuroscience. But in addition, of course, rehabilitation and neurorehabilitation in particular is going much beyond just the neuroscientific aspect.
I'll try to get out and in again and see if
that is
works.
A good idea. Okay. Okay, we have some minor technical problems will be solved soon. So the idea is that we, within the World Federation, we also want to address issues which are bordering to the core field of clinical practice and clinical science in rehabilitation. And of course, the philosophical issues play an important role in dealing with patients and trying to define goals of rehabilitation, trying to define the ontological underpinnings of all of this. And I'm happy that we today have the first issue of this series of webinars on neurophilosophy. And I'm very grateful to Professor Giorgio Zandrini and Heinrich Binder, to marshal and mastermind this new special interest group on neurophilosophy. And I may give the microphone to Professor Zandrini, who is going to introduce the sessions for today. Giorgio.
Thank you, Volker. I am pleased to briefly introduce this webinar. The most of people consider the philosophy is a purely theoretical science, far from the real world. Einstein called philosophy a kind of mother abandoned by the ungrateful children. Despite the fact that philosophy played a fundamental role in the development of the modern thought. This fact is partly related to the incredible development of science, neuroscience in particular, during the last century, since the neuroscience changed the view about several problems central in the philosophy. In 1986, Patricia Churchland was the first to introduce the term neurophilosophy to define a philosophy able to include the theories and technology coming from the field of neuroscience. This approach has represented a revolutionary change in philosophy. Since neuroscience studied the mind-brain relationship, from an objective point of view, using methods that allow us to highlight the neural correlates of some cognitive function unexplorable in the past. Northoff called this new approach a Copernican revolution, since it completely changes the perspective in the analysis of the brain and the mind functions. Dewey in 1946 suggested a new role for the philosopher as a liaison officer between the different sciences, as the philosopher have a global view of all the aspects, while other scientists tend to have a competence only in their field. Really, several other people, not just a philosopher, tried to connect the different disciplines concerning the neurophilosophy. Among neuroscience, clinical neuroscience, in particular neurohabitation, is particularly interested in neurophilosophy, since neurohabitation represents a sort of hub between the different disciplines, since patients in our field frequently show multifactorial impairment, motor, cognitive, and psychological, and so on. For this reason, as you know, 2 years ago, the World Federation of Neurohabilitation decided to create a special interest group of neurophilosophy. Today, we are really pleased to introduce the speaker of this webinar. There are eminent scientists in the field of neuroscience and neurophilosophy. Tommaso Vecchi is a professor of cognitive and experimental psychology in the University of Pavia. He's vice rector and dean of the Inter-University School of Psychology. He developed very interesting research in the field of psychology, concerning particular memory, neuromodulation, and visual disorders. Heinrich Binder is former professor of neurology in the University of Vienna. He is very well known in the field of neurohabitations, since he was the co-founder of and the president of the in the past of the European Federation of Neurohabilitation Societies, and is a co-chairman of the Special Interest Group of World Federation of for Neurohabilitation on Neurophilosophy. Now I can start with the lecture of Professor Vecchi. I think so.
Giorgio.
See?
I can hear you. I still continue. I can hear you now, but not very well. At the beginning, I have sent my presentation. Then are you going to use it, or are you supposed to give the lecture now?
I don't know. We can ask,
because basically I sent this morning as it was written in my message. And he told me that you were going to use my pre-recorded lecture and not to speak to here, but to, of course, to be here for discussion or whatever. Is this correct?
Christian, do we have a pre-recorded lecture of Professor Vecchi?
Yes, we have, and if you want, we can just play it, and the
Okay,
Professor
so I'll
can take.
play Professor Vecchi's lecture, and you will be here with us for further discussion later after that. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Good morning. I decided this title because of psychology in the last decades, and not only in the last years, but maybe 2 or 3 decades, has really experienced a kind of a revolution. It was a revolution regarding methods, a revolution regarding topics, aim of psychology, regarding the relationship with other disciplines that are around us, that really come closer, and psychologists had the need to collaborate in a much stronger way than it was in the past. So when I decided the title of this presentation, the contribution for this webinar, I tried to put together some consideration about this revolution, what this implies for the future of psychology, and to some extent also what can imply for reconsidering also our past, so the history of research in psychology. I will start with a very brief introduction about the history of psychology as it is normally considered. What happened more or less 30 years ago with the contribution of cognitive neuroscience in general, or cognitive neuroscience in particular, how different techniques have modified our theoretical paradigms and also our methods of research, neuroimaging, the contribution of other disciplines, as I said before, neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, how new disciplines or new way of interpreting experimental data arrived, and the social and affective neuroscience area, how all this relates to the computer science in terms of a neurocomputational approach to our knowledge about brain function and cognitive function. And last, what we now know about neural processes, substitution, repairs, and what this may imply for the future. A brief history of psychology. Traditionally, psychology as a science go back to the middle of 19th century, 1850, 1860s. There was a psychophysics, the first experiments trying to give numbers about how we experience external stimuli, how the external stimuli produce a sensation in humans. Weber-Fechner, the Fechner's law, Weber's law is an example of this that was happening. And a few years later, Wilhelm Wundt in Germany, in Leipzig, is traditionally considered the starting of a psychology science. It was first laboratory, first experimental data appearing. Of course, it came from the tradition of psychophysics. It was also a tradition of the structuralism that more or less was put forward by Edward Titchener in the few years later. And so this was the real beginning of psychology in Europe, and it is still considered at the birth of this new discipline as a science. At the end of the century, William James and others in US especially proposed new theories that were called functionalism. So in a slightly different perspective, these functional theories gave rise to a number of people proposing theoretical and practical interpretation of this phenomena. And from this now on, there was a group of theories, of approaches that were basically could be summarized in the paradigm of what is conditioning. So what is the relationship between stimulus and response? The stimulus coming from the stern of the body and the response of the body. At the beginning, there was the low effect. Thorndike was the first one really putting this forward in a structured way. So basically, we're trying to replicate all action that produce a benefit, and we tend to avoid any action that do not produce a benefit. It's very simple, but it's really a rule of our behavior that we tend to replicate what we like, and we tend to avoid what we don't like. This connects directly to what Ivan Pavlov at the beginning of the century discovered as a classic conditioning. So Pavlov's dog, I think we all know about this. So what does it mean that we react to external stimuli? And John Watson, behaviorism, again, a strong approach on this connection between stimulus as a response. We are going to find this also later to the operant conditioning. Skinner is maybe the most practical example of this new theories in which we understand that our behavior may be not only directly influenced by an external stimuli that by nature has a meaning for our body, but we may modulate our behavior in a very indirect way with a series of other stimuli that will be added in order to have a much more complex response. In the middle of all this, there was also Gestalt psychology that we can summarize with the word of that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Here you can see an example of what is Gestalt psychology. Here you can see two triangles, a white triangles under over a black thin line, and three round black dots that are partially covered by this white triangle. Gestalt psychology was focused more on psychology, was focused on the way that what we perceive in the world is not only modulated by the real stimulus, but from what we know of the stimulus, from laws of segmentation of the space around us. And this is true not only for perception, but also for memory, for attention, for many cognitive function. And it is not strange to understand that in the same years, Gestalt psychology was interested not only to perception, but to personality, to other cognitive function, and in particular on memory. So the psychology of witnesses, for example, has risen in that years because for the first time they realized that what we recall is not necessarily what we have learned in the past. So we modify our memories, we reconstruct our memories, and in a way that is somehow similar to what we do with our visual perception. So we arrive at the 1950s, 1960s, and the key point is probably the book by Ulrich Neisser in 1967, Cognitive Psychology, in which there was this so-called cognitive revolution. The cognitive revolution basically is trying to overcome the paradigm of stimulus response. That is a black box in the middle. So the same stimulus may give rise to a variety of response, depending on external condition, depending on previous experience, depending on the process that there is within the stimulus-response connection. So what we have to study and what psychology has to study is the black boxes. So it is what there is inside the process. Basically, inside the process now we can say that this inside is the brain, is our system that modulates our behavior. These are two examples of this cognitive way of doing research. I place here two different ideas that converge in producing similar theoretical models. One was the behavioral experiment. This is a model of Baddeley or working memory, in which by using a paradigm of dual task, selective interference, and so on, Baddeley proposed that we have in our memory and our executive memory two separate systems, one for dealing with visuospatial and the other for dealing with verbal material. In the same year, another tradition based on a clinical approach, the clinical neuropsychological approach, so looking for patient, they have a deficit, and try in double dissociation paradigm to understand which cognitive function may be independent one from the other. So if there is a double dissociation, you arrive at the same conclusion. You may have a separation between visuospatial processes and verbal processes. So this was true in experimental settings or in clinical settings. And these disciplines really developed in the same year and with the same strength in the 60s and 70s and 80s. After this, a big gap, and we arrive at this new revolution. This new revolution, let's say, is around 1990. And it was the neuroscience revolution, or it was the neuroimaging revolution. Basically, for the first time in the history of psychology, a technical progress, a technical development determined a shift in theoretical paradigms, in method of the research, and dramatic increase in our knowledge, and also gave rise to a variety of research activities that forced us to consider psychology in a different way. And this is what I would like to talk to you today, and try to understand the approach of neuroimaging, neurostimulation, neuromodulation, the social affective, as I said before, neurocomputation, system neuroscience, neuroprocess, and so on. So trying to analyze what happened in the 90s and how this revolution is still present and really modulating a lot of our work. I used to say to my students that these decades are for psychology what have been the first half of the 20th century for physics. So physics experienced a big revolution, a complete change of paradigm between 1900 and 1950. And we are probably experiencing the same revolution in psychology. So what we knew 50 years ago have been completely challenged and improved and modified, but what we know now, and we really have been obliged, in a positive sense, to reconsider the relationship between how the brain is organized and how the brain modulates our behavior. So, of course, there was research about how the brain was structured, how the brain was organized, but this information not always were appropriate in order to explain our behavior. Now we cannot ignore neuroanatomical data, neurophysiological data in order to explain behavior. And if you want to explain behavior, we cannot ignore what we know about neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. So this is a big change. Not only we have to consider this, but we also have to reconsider probably what is the past history of this discipline and how this past history affects the history of psychology itself. So if we consider neuroanatomy, and neuroanatomy is something that arrived in psychology in the last 20, 30, maybe 40 years, but then given the importance that have now neuroanatomy and how it's strictly linked with psychology, we cannot ignore that the tradition of studying the anatomy of the brain is a very long tradition. So we start from 4 centuries before Christ with Hippocrates, who considered the brain as a controller. It was a very modern view of the brain, we arrive still in the Middle Ages, in which there was the first model of memory and sensory areas in the brain. In the 1848, 1835, there was a phrenology. So the initial tentative to locate spatially a function in the brain, we now know that most of those locations are not correct. But this is not the issue. The problem was that it was really incredible that at that time, people started to produce a model of brain function that was segmented regarding of what a determinate area was there for. So what the function of specific area, and every area has a different relationship with our behavior. This produced at the end of the century the first neuropsychological data, Broca and Wernicke, the area for language. Again, in those years, most of the research tried to identify the correct location. I would say, maybe it's a kind of provocative, that Broca and Wernicke were very lucky in identifying correct areas, because if you look at papers published in the second half of the 19th century, we have a lot of research proposing a location for a specified cognitive function, and most of those were still wrong, as it was for phrenology. So maybe Broca and Wernicke were either more clever or more lucky and fortunate than others. But we start identifying specific area for a function, language in this case. Then it is very important that mid of the following century, we develop X-ray, we develop techniques to visualize the brain that in turn produce at the end of the century what is neuroimaging, neurostimulation, and all the approaches and theories deriving from these new techniques that are used in psychology. So all this became to some extent part of the history of psychology, because now we have to build again our history and our story of the importance of the neuroanatomy for defining psychological function. And in a very similar way, we can do this for neurophysiology. Neurophysiology was it is now very important. It is very important if we study resting state. So the evolution of neuroimaging of the first PET or fMRI studies are now to produce very complex model, putting together data of many different recordings, many different techniques, elaboration techniques. And this has a strong link to what happens, for example, at the end of the 19th century. Camillo Goggi is also from Pavia, so it's very important for me that I work here. I work in very close laboratory to where he was working. He discovered the first techniques of visualizing the structure of the nervous system, how the neuron was done, how the neuron could be reproduced. And in the same year, Ramon y Cajal, with this neuron theory, he put the foundation of what is modern neuroscience. They got the Nobel together at the beginning of the century, and all this link closely to the discovery of neurotransmitters, of the many important neurotransmitters related to this, to the use of psychopharmacological drugs, psychiatric drugs, neurological drugs, and so the modification that were related to this. All this tradition, it's a neurophysiological tradition that links directly to what we now call system neuroscience and to our wish of understanding not only brain areas per se, but how brain areas relate to one another, how different brain areas work differently depending on the neurotransmitters that are related to every specific part of our brains, and so on. Social affective neuroscience is a very particular part of this issues, because It is a new area of studies. It came in the last 20 or 30 years, so trying to understand in our brain not only the cognitive underlying mechanism for memory, perception, attention, or language, or whatever else, but trying to understand that in our brain we also have different areas related to our personality, to how we relate with other people, to how we relate with other people, to how we interact with the environment. And so this part of social and affective behavior could be investigated as well. Again, we have a strong link to what is called physiognomics, physiognomica. And here we can go back to Aristotle that wrote a text about the physiognomica. We can go to the Renaissance with Leonardo da Vinci that produced beautiful drawings about how the face may represent emotions. We arrive at the 18th century with Lavater in primis, but also other, Gall and Lavater, who produced these drawings. We have again Charles Darwin that investigated the expression of emotion in men and animals with beautiful photograph in this case. And we also go to Cesare Lombroso. I want to spend a couple of minutes on Cesare Lombroso about him because he has always been treated as just a very unpolite person, let's say, who used to define people on the basis of the shape of the skull and to the, you can understand, in his words, the deviant behavior by the expression of the face. Of course, this is not correct. Now we can be really interpret in a bad way what he was thinking. But if we consider what he did in more than a century ago, and if we consider that in the same years we have, for example, Broca, Wernicke, and many others that were looking for a specific brain area for language, a specific brain areas for movement, a specific brain area for reading or whatever else, then his work is not as superficial as it may seem. He simply realized for the first time that we not only we can consider the brain as an organ in which different parts may correspond to different cognitive mechanisms, but we also consider the brain as an organ in which different parts may be related to different personalities, may be related to different way of approaching others, may be related to emotion, aggressive emotions, for example. And so he was wrong, of course, but he was wrong in a similar way in which phrenology was wrong. The idea was correct, the application was wrong. And this could be considered as the first attempt to understand which are the brain areas that modulate our social or affective behavior. So what we now call social and affective neuroscience has really a tradition, has really a starting point in the physiognomics and in what, for example, Cesare Lombroso and others did in those years, in which they tried to not only relate our brain to cognitive function, but also to personality and affective behavior. Neurocomputation, of course, if we go back to this in the past, what we have is the birth of the computer science, the connectionist model in which model of based on computer were used, for example, in the 80s or 90s in order to hypothesize the structure of the brain, whereas now where we are going is trying to understand how the brain function and use the mechanism of brain function in order to produce more powerful computer. So this is a complete change of paradigm. Here the computer simulates a cognitive process, and we hypothesize in the past that how the computer was organized could be used in order to make a theory about how the brain is organized. We realized, of course, this was wrong. And now what we are doing is trying to understand how the brain works and to use this very powerful mechanism and very low energy mechanism that we have in the brain, just a few watt of energy in a sense, to produce and develop a very, very powerful computer. And last, the neuroprocesses and neurosubstitution. Now we have techniques in which either we can use artificial devices in order to substitute, for example, vision or hearing or a sense, perception. We are starting to go towards an artificial brain. Would it be possible to have an artificial brain or not? To neurogenetics, how understanding the genetic pattern that underlie brain development may help us not only to affect, to address different pathologies, but also to understand how the brain works. And all this, of course, produce very, very important and complicated bioethical questions. So what can we do, how we can do this, how an artificial brain could be possible in the future, and, for example, trying to understand that if we can simply substitute a part of the brain that is part of the motor cortex, so after a stroke, people recover the ability to move their right leg, that is okay, and we are all fine. If we are able to substitute a tiny part of the visual cortex, so after a car crash, if we may help people to recover all their visual abilities or the functionality of the visual cortex, we are all okay. But we know that now it is not possible. But what about if in a century or less or more, we are going to be able to substitute or to modify the functioning of the hippocampus or of the amygdala, of other structures that really affect our emotional behavior, our personality, our way of interacting with other people and with the environment, how this could be possible or acceptable. So we do understand the importance of bioethics, and bioethics, of course, is strictly linked to all the tradition of the psychological theories that came from philosophy and were modified and improved by the philosophical tradition, and to what we can now imagine about the future and how psychology could be characterized by this decision in a near or far future. So to conclude, psychology is redefining its competences, scopes, a relationship with other disciplines, and future perspective. We are in the middle of this revolution, and we really have to think about where we are going as a psychological scientist. New technology had a strong impact on the evolution of psychology as a science, and are continuing to influence where psychology is going. Because not only we have the neuroimaging, now we have much more complex techniques, and this will modify the role of psychology in the future. We have new constraints on the relationship between brain and behavior. We cannot ignore brain as well as we cannot ignore behavior. So we need to find a relationship between how the brain is organized, structured, how the brain works, and how we behave. We cannot ignore either of these data. So we must consider both of them in any theory that we are going to develop. And of course, we have ethical issues and new perspectives in interpreting human nature, individual differences, and the nature-nurture debate. So this is basically the original debate in which in the Greek word psychology started. So we are modulated by biological mechanism, of course, Plato and Aristotle were not talking about biological methods, but the meaning of this, so which is the role of biological and which is the role of the environment. Thank you very much.
Okay, Giorgio, are you going on for the discussion? Or?
Yes. Do you prefer to discuss now the lecture of Professor?
I think so. I think it's probably better.
Okay.
Just for the audience, just please use the chat room for any questions, so that we can convey them to the speakers involved.
Yes.
You have a look, brief look at the chat room.
I think that I have a first point to be discussed. I think that the lecture of Tommaso is very exciting for the number of problems that is relevant in this lecture. My question is concerning the problem. This is very relevant from a neuroethics point of view, since we are understanding some mechanism concerning the decisions, the making decision mechanism, that are able to create some conditioning factors in our decisions. There are a lot of examples, of course, but the main aspects concern is indirectly the problem of the free will, since it's emerging that there is a relevant part of our brain that is able to decide out of our free will or decisions or our voluntary. We know that, for instance, that some drugs can modify our emotion, but also the capacity to take some decision. Tommaso, what do you think about these aspects?
If you start with the free will question, of course, you're going in a very complicated and difficult answer, and we all know that. So let's take it for granted that it's a very complicated question, and it really depends on how you define free will. You define free will in terms of that we are completely free of our previous experience, then no, I don't think so. I think that we are really stuck in a positive sense, because our previous experience gave us the material in order to interpret the present and the future in the best possible way. And so not really in a conscious way, we can say, so not really in a voluntary way we use a previous experience, but still our memory, our information, what we know, all the information that we use in order to interpret the present is dependent upon what we experienced in the past. So in this sense, we have a free will in the sense that we have the free will of redefining our previous experience and use it. Then, as you said, then you can have pathologies, or you can have a car crash, and you have a problem in the frontal areas and prefrontal areas, and you can have a very particular kind of behavior in which your inhibition area seems not to work anymore. So what does this mean? Then that was your free will, because then you do not have any more inhibition in your behavior. This, I feel, that is simply shows that even for defining what is correct and what is not, defining what you want to do or not, we have certain specific area that are connected, related, used, and all together this determine what we define, or we personally maybe define in very different way, but what we call free will. That's a combination of how the brain works and all the previous experience that we have that guide us in order to take in a free way the best possible decision, let's say. So this is really what I think, that the role of experience is strong, and this produces the free will.
Yeah. So probably the question, thank you, probably the questions, free will or not free will is wrong, since our brain is conditioned by several unconscious and external and genetic factors, and they are deeply conditioning our decisions. Is probably is it's real that it's true that we can decide what to do, but we are strongly conditioned by our emotions and our past and so on.
Okay, I think, Tommaso, thank you very much for putting on this important we will not have time to discuss that in detail. Let me briefly go over two questions which are in the
also Eric
answer not to ignore the audience. One question is, what do you think will be the future of neuroplasticity and neural computing?
What I think is that we are going to have the possibility to create neural prosthesis, very complicated to perfectionate. What I don't know if this is going to happen in 10 years, in 50 years, or in 200 years. So the fact that now we are able to substitute a tiny part of our visual cortex, or our motor cortex, and this, of course, are the areas in which it's very easy, in a sense, because it's really a switcher. It's a connection in which you have a neuron arriving at a single neuron in the visual cortex. We know what is doing and why it's there. Even we know the difference, even at a layer level, or even at a single neuron level to some extent. In principle, I do feel that this will be possible for all our brain. I'm rather sure that no one of us will see this in our life. Surely I don't. I don't think that will happen in 20 years or in 30 years or in 50 years, maybe. I do feel that it's very complicated also because the visual cortex or the motor cortex are areas that are very, very similar in every individual. So the organization is very similar, whereas other parts of the brain are developing in many different ways, are more dependent upon experience, and so on. So the possibility of having a neural substitution in terms of a processes is completely different in terms of a complexity that you have to deal about, but is also completely different in terms of the effect that this may have to the individual. Because if you just substitute a part of the brain that you know how it's organized and what a single neuron is there for, then it's okay, but other areas are really completely different, and the neural migration, for example, of the first couple of years, or many other effects that we have in our own life, modifies completely our brain. And so I do feel, yes, that we are going to be there at some point. I believe it will be quite a long way through.
Okay, well, there are some systems existing already now, but we will see how that goes. Let me briefly go over the list of questions. Another participant asked, do you consider any gender-specific differences to be found in future?
Well, there are
many
ways of considering gender difference. from a biological point of view, you have differences from the amount of hormones that we have in our blood. There are differences, and the amount of hormones have a direct influence on the neurotransmitters and so on. So if you are just talking about biological differences, we know that we have biological differences. How this may be related to experience, life, and how we express our masculinity or femininity, or how we express other gender-related effect, I don't think that we are going to really have any specific difference that is considered gender-related. So there are 2 points of view that you cannot ignore the biological part, and of course you cannot ignore all the cultural, environmental, and individual effect that may be gender mediated.
I have a short comment about this point, since just a few weeks ago, it was published a very interesting paper concerning the role of oxytocin in zebrafish, in fish, that change completely their behavior. And this well knows that this hormone plays a very, very relevant role in the female during when they have the son. This very interesting paper of Patricia Chaslan about a book about this aspect, and they change their behavior concerning the children, concerning the aggressivity against the enemy. And we have to consider that some modulation hormonal is clearly relevant also from concerning the behavior and other neurological functions.
Okay. Well, there's another question I'd like to raise. Is Maximiliano Gubbo is asking, can we say that Gestalt can be basically explained by the existence of secondary areas connected to other brain regions?
I don't know if this question is related to how we use previous experience of in our, for example, visual perception. It is true that in a standard perception, sensory perception, we use both bottom-up and top-down processes. Bottom-up are, of course, related to the what we are seeing, what we are hearing, and to how the stimulus, for example, are organized. And so all the stimulus may produce some effect related also to how our sensory processes are structured. At the same time, we use our previous experience in order to give rules to the visual percept. So you can say that, of course, in a sense, our visual cortex is modulated by other areas, or vice versa, maybe also are the other areas that through experience have modulated how our visual cortex is experienced. So how our visual areas receive from the optic nerve and send it to secondary areas in order, for example, to recognize object or to interpret the visual pattern that you have. So surely, but this is, I think it's a general rule of our brain. It's very difficult to say that a single area is uniquely and alone relevant in doing whatever cognitive process. It is not like this. Our brain is continuously changing. It's continuously modifying its content. And this is used in every process, also in every sensory process that we have.
Okay. Heinrich was raising his hand in between. I give you a chance, Heinrich, to intervene now.
Pardon me?
No, you had a question as far as I.
No, I had no question.
Okay, then let me go on with the list of questions here. Lloyd Bradley is asking, given that these technologies can be deployed by the very wealthy, it is likely to accelerate existing social inequalities?
Every technological process is somehow accessible in a different way regarding of in the country in where you live, the city in where you live, the how you are wealthy or not in your country. So this could be true for this technology, could be true for the quality of the food that you have available, would be related to everything. So I don't think that this specifically may be related to the accelerating or reducing social inequalities, or at least not in a different way, for example, to our possibility to assess a new pharmacological treatment or whatever. And personally, of course, it is true that we have a new pharmacological treatment, for example, for a very invalidating pathology. It is true that at the beginning, this treatment may be accessible only to a small part of the population for many different reasons, but in the end, this will lead to widespread this new treatment to larger and larger part of the population of the countries and so on. So of course it is like this, but I feel that the process in the end will be a positive process that will lead to a benefit to the whole population of the world. Yeah, maybe yes, in the very end.
Okay, we'll see, Tommaso. Thank you very much for a glorious talk. I have one final question to you. I'm talking a lot to philosophers around the world almost every week. And my feeling is that many of the people who are now in the field of philosophy and ontology and epistemology and whatever have you, have the impression that neuroscience, in some sense, is taking over what originally philosophy was, what theology was in the past. What's your opinion about that?
I understand why people may think this. At the same time, I feel that, for example, for what we have just said about neurosubstitution, or to what we can say about computing, for example, or how we can use what we know about the brain in order to build a more powerful computer and more saving energy computer and so on, will give back a role to some, let's say, philosophical approach in which we have to understand what our brain is, what we want, how we want to consider our brain as humans, and the definition of what our brain is could also lead to the ethical issues that we mentioned before. So what happens if we are going to substitute a part of the brain at some point, and this part of the brain have some role in determining the personality of an individual or the affective behavior of this individual? So how we learn little by little, also from a social and cultural point of view, how to consider our brain and how to accept that our brain determines also our personality and our affection and our way of relating with others. I feel that will be extremely useful when at some point we will be able also to modulate this in some kind of artificial way.
Okay, so you think there's still jobs left for philosophers?
Yes.
Also in the future.
I do feel there will be.
Thank you very, very much indeed. I think we carry on. Giorgio, introduce the next speaker. Thanks a lot, Tommaso. Great to have you.
Thanks to you.
Thank you very much, Tommaso. The next speaker is Professor Heilbinder, This talk is concerning the concept of creativity and the relationship between creativity and science and neuroscience. Please, we can show this lecture.
Ladies and gentlemen, the topic of my presentation is creativity and scientific thought. Let me first say that creative thinking and scientific thinking are inseparable. The starting point and goals are the same. It is about solving a problem, and their part in it is diverse. I'll try to explain one thing and the other and show how both go hand in hand. Let me state at the outset that the concept of creativity is a Western concept, and the common history is largely an European and American one. Creativity is a rather modern concept. The term creativity appears for the first time in William Ward's History of Dramatic English Literature, with reference to William Shakespeare's poetic creativity. But it wasn't until the middle of the 19th century that the word creative appeared in connection with arts, as a kind of romantic elevation to a superior status compared to craft activities. That doesn't mean, of course, that creative thinking didn't appear until this time. We already assume creative thinking in our predecessors and also in the animal kingdom. But apparently it only came into our mental focus under this name around this time. There is general consensus on two core elements of cross-domain creativity: originality, novelty, and appropriateness, relevance. Originality means that an idea is unique or unusual compared to other ideas at a certain point in time or defined period of time. New means that it has not yet been expressed in an identical or comparable way. But what's the use of an original idea if it cannot be more successfully applied than another one before, at least in a certain spatial and temporal context? And this means appropriateness. This is part of the so-called frame of reference concept, which means that an idea can be creative in a certain context, but not in another context. For example, on the one hand, there is a creativity in the individual era, on the other hand, in an historical context, such as nuclear power. It can affect me, my family, my profession, or, as in the case of climate change, all of mankind. However, additional features are required from many authors. Margaret Boden cited first and foremost surprise, which is admittedly difficult to distinguish from novelty. Such a surprise can occur when several unfamiliar concepts are combined in an unusual way, as is the case with metaphor, for example. This is then called combinatorial idea generation. With the exploratory idea generation, it can also happen that thoughts already appear in the repertoire, but suddenly open up a new perspective. And lastly, there is a downright revolutionary form, the transfemorational idea generation. This is an experience that occurs so suddenly and unexpectedly that one claims impossible in shock. Allegedly, this is said to have been with Hall's discovery of the structural relationships between nerve cells. The fact is, none of these types appear in isolation. There are always mixed forms. Freshness is an alternative concept that is a combination of novelty and surprise. And last but not least, the realization of the idea. Of course, this fits in with previously expressed appropriateness. It means that an idea must not just be grasped. It must also be maintained, implemented, evaluated, and elaborated. As McKinnon wrote, a creative product has to be produced. Now we come to the big talking point, science. Leaving aside the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and so on, the beginning of modern science as a scientific revolution around the 17th century is mainly associated with names like Descartes, Newton, Bacon. If you take the famous story of Newton about the falling apple and the law of gravitation, this scientific revolution starts with such a surprising event that is so typical of creativity. Essential was, however, empirical evidence and the resulting causality, and with that we already have gotten the key points of scientific thinking. Scientific thinking begins with observation, the targeted, attentive reception of objects, phenomena, or processes. Special about Newton's observation was that it was a random everyday experience. As far as is known, he was not visually impaired and also not colorblind, so he could probably also classify the apple as the flower of Kant. But he went beyond and asked for reason, and later on developed a causality in the form of the axiom of the law of gravitation. So the hour of birth of empiricism has begun with an everyday and not with a scientific observation. This brings us to the observer himself. It's about his willingness to see something, to classify it, to openness for new experiences, and not to take things for granted. So it's also about personal traits, and not at least also knowledge. A typical example for this would be Darwin on the survey voyage on the HMS Beagle and his notebooks whereby his theory of evolution is formulated ultimately. The picture on the right is from one of his notebooks and is one of the first sketches concerning his theory of evolution. Alas, we have to realize that our cognitive structures are adapted to our terrestrial world. Our forms of perception and categories cover only part of the world, the mesocosmos. Only the momentum of the technical progress gained in the middle of the 19th century gave us an indirect glimpse onto the macrocosmos and the microcosmos in areas that we can lastly only grasp or describe with structures of mathematics. In addition to this, so to speak, external domain, there are also those of inward domain, which is something created through thought or a relationship established by thinking, a field of cognitive psychology and last not least psychoanalysis. The next step is the documentation, the ordering of what has been seen and the determination and description of a problem, a situation for which there is no explanation from a scientific, professional or real-world context. Now, questions are asked as a basis of upcoming reasoning process. In the process of hypothesis generation that now follows, it comes to formulation of possible answers to these questions based on known models, frameworks, or evidence. This brings us to the so-called hypothesis testing and the three inference operations. In classic deductive reasoning, I start from premises that are considered true and come to a certain conclusion as a logical consequence. Mathematics is a classic case of deductive reasoning. With inductive reasoning, I assume premises that are likely true and I come to a probable conclusion, as is the case with statistical generalization. An example of this is the statistical inference of a sample on a population. In the case of abductive reasoning, which was defined by Peirce, it is about the fact that the starting point, the premise, is uncertain because we cannot be sure of our perception, as is the case with Necker's cube, for example. The resulting possible conclusion is a typical case of creative enterprise. If we have a conclusion, the question of evidence arises. We can only expect absolute certainty with deductive reasoning if all information corresponds with the hypothesis without restriction. But since we can never be sure that all information is available or complete, absolute certainty can never be achieved. Otherwise, we are in the graded range of plausibility, achievable by several methods, amongst them controlled experiments or observational studies and statistical methods. But now There's another essential point, communication. In order to be recognized as evident, it needs the recognition of Ludwig Fleck's Denkkollektiv, the thinking collective. The responsible scientific community on which it ultimately depends with whether a result becomes a paradigm or not. I already mentioned creativity in connection with brainstorming and the methods of scientific thought. Now I would like to come across the various aspects and also conditions of creativity. The first and hotly debated question is, can you objectively assess creativity, quantitatively, qualitatively in terms of content? To do this, you first have to know what to measure. Are the defining features sufficient? The earliest attempt goes back to James Melvin Rhodes, who made different strands of conceptualizations within the definition of creativity. The 4 P's of creativity: process, product, person, place. This raises the question of which characteristics can be used to distinguish between people with high and low creative potency. In other words, what are the characteristics of traits that make a creative person? I would like to quote from 2 interesting works. The first, by Cassandro and Simonton, deals with the constellation of stable personality traits of highly creative people. The second, by Jauch and co-workers, investigates the importance of intelligence in connection with creativity. Due to a wealth of works that suggested a connection between personality traits and creativity, a historiometric study was carried out with 2012 creative geniuses based on their outstanding work. In a subsample of 38 of them, additional autobiographical information was used and transferred to the adjective checklist. People with a high level of creativity judged themselves to be clever, confident, egoistic, humorous, individualistic, informal, insightful, intelligent, and so on, and denied to be affected, cautious, commonplace, conservative, conventional, dissatisfied, honest, interest narrow, mannerly, sincere, submissive, and suspicious. Many of these adjectives correspond to the so-called Big 5 personality traits: extraversion, agreeableness, openness to experience, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. Whereby high scores on the openness to experience, as well as tests of divergent thinking and reduced lateral inhibition, correlate highly with creative ability, which will come back later. 2 critical remarks to this publication. In this study are exclusively men included, and there is no normal comparison group which does not allow generalization. What is concluded from Cassandra and Simonton? Creativity is largely tailored to a specific domain. The well-known 10-year rule of expertise acquisition applies. Artistic creativity requires higher levels of openness than is required for scientific creativity, and highly creativists show exceptional versatility. In addition, I will show you 2 examples of high versatility from another work by White. I think nobody will doubt about Goethe's creativity, and his diverse interests in other areas are probably also known. With Franklin, however, I'm not so sure, but that may be due to my Eurocentrism. Let me now turn to the subject of intelligence. For many decades, people have wondered how creativity and intelligence are related. Especially, and essentially, the threshold hypothesis has represented that above-average intelligence is a prerequisite for high creativity, and an IQ threshold of 120 is assumed with different conditions below and above. The study by Jauch et al., the first page I have shown you before, examines this using a sample of 297 people. It turns out that there is a positive linear correlation between IQ and creativity up to a threshold of 120. This means lower IQ scores are associated with lower creativity. This does not apply to higher values. If creativity is broken down to fluency, the number of responses in a so-called divergent thinking task, and the originality of the responses according to quantitative and qualitative aspects. The former shows a significantly lower value of 86. This means that up to this threshold there exists a correlation with intellectual ability, but other factors, such as personality factors, social adjustment, emotional stability, gain more importance. But it is interesting that there is no threshold for creative achievement. It means real accomplishment, and that a constant linear relationship remains here. What else makes the difference, why some people are more and others less creative? There are three starting points that relate to associative hierarchy, attention, and inhibition, as well as arousal. The knowledge storage model, as shown here, differentiates high and low creative individuals based on the range of the semantic network, as they can recognize it based on a target word, in that case, white. Low creative individuals show a narrow network with high lateral inhibition. High creative individuals show a highly distributed network with low lateral inhibition. The knowledge access model has something to do with the spotlight model of attention. On the one hand, you see the narrow spotlight of the less creative individual. On the other hand, the contrast to the broadened light beam of the highly creative individual. The third concept of the conceptual primordial cognition continuum was developed by Colin Martindale and has psychoanalytic roots. It is about a continuum of states of mind between normal wakefulness over different levels of reverie up to dreaming. He assumes that disinhibited and defocused cognition outside of cognitive control walk hand in hand with higher creative potency. However, this is lost again in the sense of an inverted U function with increasing cognitive impairment. That could fit in with certain anecdotal reports, such as about Kerkul, among others. However, there are a number of studies that show a different linear correlation. The next point concerns the creative product, the output of creative thinking, a thought, an idea that is communicated with other people, which becomes embodied into a tangible form, as Rhodes puts it. These can be words, images, and different materials. Gardner tried a certain systematic and differentiated 5 types of creative ideas and products. As you can see, the first 2 have a lot to do with science. Take, for example, solution of a well-defined problem. One could certainly use the Watson and Crick DNA model as an example, or the encompassing theory of Freud's consciousness theories. Sternberg chose a different approach with his propulsion model. He wonders how creativity achieves progress. This includes changes in the perception of an area, reorientation, or a new beginning, or a merging of ideas, and some more. When I come to the fourth, press and place, I mean the individual work area, the environment as a whole. Of course, this primarily concerns the case of organizational creativity. This is about intrinsic motivation, the promotion of joy, interest, challenge. The allocation of the right tasks, the autonomy in the choice of solution methods, the right composition of the team with regard to diversity, background and expertise with appropriate supervision, and, last but not least, of course, the optimal allocation of time, money, and space. If we call it a micro level, you also have to look for a macro level. This is about systemic or sporadic patronage, as was the case with Renaissance artists, for example, Michelangelo's Medici. Nowadays, however, this task is primarily carried out by government and fund initiatives, or, as in the USA, tax incentives to creative industries. What is a creative process? It can be described as a mental process that consists of a complex mixture of cognitive, motivational, and emotional processes. In principle, everyone is creative. The only differences are in the extent and quality of the processes. It is interesting that the creative process, similar to scientific thinking or reasoning, can be divided into different stages. On the various models, I'll take Graham Waller's four-stage theory as an example. Wallace differentiates between preparation, incubation, illumination, and verification with highly variable timescales. Preparation is about identifying a problem and defining it. By incubation, he understands a phase of disengagement, of a break, in which one is occupied with cognitive undemanding distraction tasks of different stimulus modality. It is known that such breaks have a positive effect on problem solving for a long time. The third state is the intimation. It is a moment of realizing of a breakthrough. The last phase of verification is about testing, expanding and implementing the idea. If you compare this model with the 8 epistemic activities of scientific reasoning, as Hetmanek describes, you will notice a great accordance and the richness of details. There are, of course, a number of other models, regardless of which one is used. A number of cognitive operations are always available with these process models in order to be creatively successful. Insight, in the course of problem solving, is a moment of recognition of a previously unknown conceptual connection. The moment of surprise, the eureka or aha moment as a consequence of overcoming functional fixedness and engaging in a perspective shift. There are a number of mental creative operations that can lead to such insight. And if you look at the individual cognitive processes, there are processes that are ubiquitous in all of science. I'll care to elaborate this now. I mentioned divergent thinking just before in connection with intelligence. The corresponding and quasi-opposite term would be convergent thinking. I have to admit that I took these pictures from Wikipedia because it seemed to me to be the clearest representation. It shows the main differences. The divergent thinking, it is the question that leads us to cross borders and produce as many ideas as possible. Convergent thinking is based on facts in order to get a valid result. If you ask me if both are necessary for creativity, then I have to say yes. But there is also a but. Multiple solutions do not guarantee originality and useful results. Divergent thinking without convergent thinking harbors the risk of only generating quasi-creative or pseudo-creativity. If we leave the logical incremental algorithm in problem solving aside, we come to two related associative processings, the analogy or analogical reasoning and the metaphor. In the analogy, there is a novel association between two previously unconnected conceptual frameworks. The degree of creativity correlates with the semantic distance of the domains. Kitten is to cat as a puppy to dog. Is not so creative as blindness is to poverty as to money. The difference between metaphor and analogy lies in the combination of dissimilar domains, independent from language according to Lakoff. One of the best known examples is perhaps Bohr's comparison of the electron trajectories around the nucleus of the hydrogen atom with the planetary movement around the Sun. As you may know, it is an evolution of Rutherford's atomic model. By the way, a further example that confirms the continuity of science. With regard to metaphorics, Werner Heisenberg has made a statement. He clearly stated that our ability to understand the world reaches its limits, which is through our senses. He essentially refers to the previously mentioned model of mesocosmos and the need to use metaphors, images, similes, which come from our middle dimension to explain and understand what is beyond this narrow mesocosmos. Let's get to imagery. Imagery is seen as central to achieve creative insights. Imagery is an integrative process that combines memory, emotion, perception, and action. And imagery can come in different forms. Since this includes daydreaming as well as thought experiments. I would like to cite two examples. First, Einstein's thought experiment from 1895 with a moving observer who tries to catch up with a point on a light wave whose source at rest ultimately led to his theory of relativity, and second, August Kerkules' insight into the structure of the benzene atom. Kerkule and the structure of the benzene ring is mentioned again and again as a classic example of imagery. There's more inside the story than just imagery. I'll take the text from his speech on the occasion of an honor by the German Chemical Society in March 1890. The original text is on the left, my translation on the right. In this short sequence, he points out a very important point, that scientific work and knowledge does not fall from the sky, but is a result of tedious work. But now to the appropriate topic. In the following quotes, this time only in translation, he describes two events that can be interpreted as a kind of daydreaming. The first event in London shows an imagery of abstract structures that ultimately shape themselves in a particular way. The second event in Belgium seems to be a kind of daydreaming again, but according to my interpretation, it was preceded by a break, a distraction. We know that it can promote creativity. Then the abstract features on the imagery reappeared, which ultimately lead to the famous metaphor of the snake biting its tail. Conceptual expansion is the ability to expand a concept or to go beyond boundaries of established conceptual structures, also to add new elements. Sometimes it helps to leave the locked-up thinking and to think the seemingly impossible in order to overcome a mental barrier, as it were in science fiction. Here are some examples of conceptual expansion. What you see are tasks that children of different ages were given as part of a study to investigate development-correlated development of creativity. The task works. Draw a house that does not exist. Draw a funny house. Draw an interpreting house. A house you invent, a funny man or a pretend animal. Going into development changes and creativity would go beyond the scope. I just want to show you with the help of the pictures what one understands by conceptual expansion. In the cases shown, you will see deletion of elements, insert of new elements, insertion of cross-category elements. Sometimes it helps to leave the thinking locked up in a wall and to think the seemingly impossible in order to overcome a mental barrier, as it were in a science fiction. Also, this is not necessarily a practical example, it at least shows the principle and it has something to do with the so-called divergent thinking. Now I come to my last picture. Scientists assume that the organization of the universe follows basic rules. They are constantly on searching for such final rules, put forward ideas in form of hypotheses, theories and axioms. But it is like to have been Daniel the carrot in front. As knowledge progresses, more and more doors open with new insights. That is why scientists are constantly forced to review, test, adapt, further develop, or even reject. We could take scientific reasoning as an umbrella term and see creative thinking as a servant. But I am of the opinion that one cannot be without the other. Creative thinking without the organizing power of scientific thought runs astray. Scientific thought without creativity would be stubborn, conservative, a restricted thinking from which one cannot expect any progress in knowledge. In this respect, I repeat, the one cannot work without the other. Thank you for attention.
Okay, thank you very much. we have certainly time for some discussion. Giorgio, would you want to lead to the discussion?
Yes, thank you, Harry. It's a very interesting lecture. I have short questions. Several people reported that their creativity happened during the sleep or half sleep, as you remind in one slide. And this is true for both the artistic and the scientific creativity. Moreover, probably some processes concerning creativity happens during the so-called mind-wandering activity. What do you think about these aspects?
Giorgio, unfortunately, the connection is very bad. So I understood only a few words from your question. The last point I understood was the night wandering, the connection to creativity. This is true. This exists, and this was also described from Freud during a series of subconsciousness and so on. This is well known, and I tried to show you a comparable situation in the picture that showed you from Kerkul and the Benzol ring. He describes such a night wandering or a kind of night wandering, and the idea of the Benzol ring. So I think that a free floating and mind is necessary. Also, ability to have a situation in which free-floating mind is possible is absolute basically for creativity. And then during this process, you have to catch the points and to breaken the ideas and to interpret what you have in your mind, and then you have to clarify it and to summarize in a conclusion. I think this is a process of creativity, in other words, and this is. And all the points what I have talked just now are in principle philosophy methods of phenomenological breaking or of hermeneutic interpreting and analytic clarifying and discursive arranging. This is all included in this creative process.
Okay, Heinrich, I just go briefly to the chat room to keep the audience involved. Yes, one question from Jimmy Jose. Do you think we as humans have the right creativity to use the knowledge and information about the neurosciences? Which is a little bit strange question. If we have the right creativity to use the knowledge and information about neurosciences. Well, Heinrich, although it's warm and Vienna seems to be frozen. Some sense. Yeah, so the internet connection is not the best. There was another question.
Questions.
Heinrich, can you hear us again? Oh, really?
No.
Well, there's some problem with his internet connection, obviously. Christian, can we do anything about that? Not at the moment. There's another question from Jimmy Jose, which probably I am the best to answer. Do you think rehabilitation, amputee rehabilitation will be available to the masses who require them. That, of course, is a question for the president of the World Federation rather than to the others here. I think yes. I think we are thinking about doing that, and we will see. But at the moment, I totally agree. It's not really feasible everywhere. Okay, Heinrich, can you hear us again?
Think
Frozen again. Heinrich, can you hear us? That is a similar come to Japan and to a rural area in Japan and to try to make yourself understood. You're basic in receptive and in expressive terms. So it's very similar to that. Okay, Christian, we could probably ask Heinrich to join in again, because otherwise it will be difficult to establish the telecommunication.
Waiting for the new connection from Eric, I'd like to ask to Tommaso a comment about the role of memory during the sleep, the dream phase, since it is completely changed our concept of the function of the sleep. Now we know that the sleep is useful also for elaborating strategy, unconscious, unconscious to create order in our unconscious memory.
I feel that there are many research that now establish the role of sleep in terms of consolidating memories and so on. Yeah. The problem is that if sleep is working specifically on memory, or if sleep is working generally in terms of course, putting our brain in a good shape, let's say. So this is related to other concepts. So what does it mean that our brain is tired? And this seems to be obvious, but is not, because if you are running, of course, we know that after a while we are tired and we have lactic, our acid in our muscles, and this produces our tiredness of tiring. But if you are studying for 5 hours, 6 hours, then the brain is tired. What does it mean that this brain is tired? And how the sleep may help recovering the brain from this tiredness. So in my not scientific view, let's say, or maybe not a scientific way in which I explain this to my students, for example, I used to say that if you consider that brain works in an electrical fashion, and you have the neurotransmitter that help this sodium calcium reaction in order to allow the electricity to pass from one neuron to the other, synapses to the other, is like when you have a glass full of water and you start moving the water from one glass to the other. And after a while, there is one drop out, two drop out, and so on. Then you arrive at that you sleep, you have the REM phase, you have this electric shock in a sense, and this electric shock put all the water back to the one glass, and then you can start again, and so you recover. This is because we understand that this part is very important. So if you need to recover from brain tiredness, what you need is the REM phase, REM. So it's not the other part of the sleep, probably. So this is good for memory. Yes, this is good for memory for sure. I cannot answer if this is good for memory because the brain starts working in a good form, or because that phase really contributes to stabilizing our memories or new information. But something very important that I think that we have to keep in mind is that our brain is continuously changing. I mean, you and other people have attended this seminar, and maybe people now are able to recognize my face. They have never seen me, and now they are able to recognize my face, or Giorgio, or Volker, or whatever, whoever. This means that our brain is different from half an hour ago, because if the brain is identical to our brain of 2 hours ago, it means that the new information are not in the brain. So the fact that we have new information, that this new information contributed to change the content already existing in the brain, it means that the brain is different. It's something that you have always to keep in mind. So memory means changing of the brain. Learning means changing of the brain. So also the role of sleep must be interpreted as how the brain is changing, how this changing of the brain could be boosted or decreased or modulated by our brain, our sleep, or our REM phase.
Thanks very much for this comment, Maso. I think there's an awful literature on the consolidation of memory traces during various phases of sleep. Avi Carney from Tel Aviv was one of the first guys 25 years ago starting work on this. And it's still an enigma in the sense that at what sleep phases memory or parts of memory or what aspects of memory may be consolidated, but it certainly works. The thing which does not work really, and there's no good evidence for that, is what sometimes parents tell the children, that you should put the book under the pillow when they sleep, and then it emanates from the book into the brain. There's no good evidence for that. Okay, unfortunately, our dearest friend Heinrich has not rejoined us. Nevertheless, concerning the problem of creativity, within the last, let's say, 6 months or so, there is a growing challenge to the field, in the sense that with ChatGPT and other bots, in how far artificial intelligence really can be an adjunct or even a replacement for creativity of man. And I may ask the gentleman being here and also the audience to make some comments on this. Is there a chance that there's an augmentation of the human mind in the sense that creativity can be, let's say, outsourced into artificial intelligence systems? Who wants to answer? Giorgio first. Andrew is unfortunately not here, but
yes.
Yeah.
This is really controversial, the topic of the artificial intelligence and the creativity, since we know that it's one of the more difficult plays is the chess. It's partly founded on the on probability calculations, but also on creativity. We know that the supercomputer employed more than 10 years to be able to win against the best player of chess, and the computer was able to be winner and absolute winner when we teach it to have a creativity, to have experience of the wrong of the other people during the play, and if there is only a static, it's of course the artificial intelligence is incredibly powerful for the calculation of probability, but without creativity, it's unable to win the brain, the human brain. But of course, if it is a game is very difficult, chess, but it's very limited about the rule and the possibility of no, the possibility is enormous, but about the problem to be solved. I think in the future it is very difficult problems, in particular concerning the neuroethical problems, since we don't know what kind of autonomy could be have the artificial intelligence for making decisions, for instance. It's a big problem.
Okay. Well, I like the idea, Giorgio, of decision making and how far artificial intelligence may blend in. That is absolutely crucial more and more in many medical decisions when it comes to guideline construction and so forth. I could imagine. I've spent years and years in guidelines, and I know precisely that artificial intelligence can do that much better than we can do that. But nevertheless, I'm a little bit hesitant to make that as a let's say rule for decisions. Tommaso, what's your feeling about that?
My feeling again, I think that at the end of this, you will look at me as a very progress related person in a sense, sure. And I think I am in some way. So I do feel that artificial intelligence may to some extent produce creativity. I don't think it's magic. I think that creativity comes from a reorganization of existing information, of some stimulus, comes from many different ways. But what we are starting to see now in terms of how is using artificial intelligence and how is conceived and how it approach our everyday problems, in many cases produce some creativity, or what we call creativity. How complex could be this creativity, how this information that are used by a computer, because basically artificial intelligence are algorithms used by a computer, is not something strange. So how this algorithm that we put into a computer may produce something creative, I think that to some extent this is possible, because it's simply widening the kind of information that that can be used in order to answer a specific problem. So if you widen up this kind of algorithm that you use in order which kind of information could be useful in order to answer the question, in a sense, you also widen up the possibility that you have a creative answer, at least to some extent.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a good point. I think artificial intelligence, as far as I can see it at the moment, from my perspective and from my experience, and I like to play quite a lot around that, artificial intelligence is superb, absolutely superb, if you're dealing with overviewing and compiling giant amounts of information, which today more and more is of importance, of course. We have a couple of thousand papers every year in the field of neurorehabilitation, just neurorehabilitation, about 7,500, 8,000 this year. And nobody is ever able to really digest all this information. And artificial intelligence can be helpful in organizing that, compiling that, and overviewing that. In this sense, it's also good in reassembling information, in the sense that you pick particular aspects of information and you try to reassemble this. this has given the wrong experience that artificial intelligence can be creative. If you ask an AI system to paint, let's say, a panel like Raffaello Sanzio, right? Mm-hmm. And they will come up with something similar, but if you look precisely at it, it's not Raffaello Sanzio, of course, it's a composition of elements, because the AI picks elements and reassembles elements. And that the question is this creativity? The point is, it's nothing new. The AI does not create anything new. It just puts together information which is existing, may reassemble information which is existing, and from the reassemblement as such, there may arise some sort of new ideas. That's possible. But I think artificial intelligence is not creative in the strict sense. So that is probably the point. And I have quite some experience over the last years with AI systems. I like AI systems a lot. I think they can be extremely helpful. They can be extremely helpful, but they are in the strict sense not creative. I think Heinrich is back. Mm-hmm. This is great. So other questions, Heinrich, we just briefly talked about the challenge of creativity by artificial intelligence systems, which are becoming available more and more, and it's very much in the decision. Do you have an opinion about the, let's say, the tension field between AI, artificial intelligence, and creativity in the form you use? Heinrich? Can you hear it? Heinrich? I see that he's there, and he's not frozen. Heinrich? Can you hear us? You have to unmute your microphone, I think. Right? Can you hear us? Obviously not. Christian, can we do anything about that?
I don't think we can. No. Professor Binder should. Can you hear us, Professor Binder? I don't think he can.
Okay. So you see, even today, we sometimes may have technological problems. Let me have a look at the audience field. Let me see, are there any more questions coming in? Yeah, there's one question from Archimi. Do you think that humans have the right creativity to use the knowledge and information about neurosciences? Well, question. Do we need creativity to use science? That's a good question. Giorgio, do you want to answer this?
Oh, it's very difficult. I hope so, but I'm unable to respond.
Well, that is yeah. There's some hidden caveats, of course, in this question. Tommaso, any comment on this?
No, not really.
Not really. Okay. Well, using science, of course, does not need creativity. It's just to use it. Creativity is to make it usable in a sense you would not have expected when you started to use it. That is probably a possible answer to that. Heinrich, can you hear us? Okay, obviously not. So we come to the end, I think, of this session. Thank you very much for joining us today. We will go on with this. We had Patricia Schurchman today could not join us because she had laryngitis and cannot speak. So we will postpone that to the next session. I may thank the audience. I may thank the speakers very much, and also my dear friend Christian for doing all the technology work and the back office as usual in an optimal way. And next time, I hope that we will have Heinrich back unfrozen and in good shape. So thank you very much, and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.